Ladies and gentlemen, we are back with part two. We kept the microphones and the cameras and the tapes rolling, as they said in the old days, and we are back with a broadcasting legend, a Memphis cultural icon, the man that has called more professional wrestling matches in his career than anyone walking the face of the earth, the voice of Memphis wrestling, Lance Russell himself. And Lance, thank you for sticking around because we got so much more to talk about. I told you I was going to ask you 1,000 questions. And
oh, hey, listen, I got to tell you, is that the reason why that this suit looks like a same one that I wore last week? That's probably because I don't have but one suit. That's all, and it's a Baxter clothes. So I
was about to say you used to sponsor Baxter suits in Memphis, and Lawler came out one time when you were on vacation, and Dave was doing it, and Lawler announced that, ladies and gentlemen, Lance had a death in his family. One of his Baxter suits passed away. It shined itself to death, and he couldn't be here today. But you last
you
week
guys.
We talked last week about the pioneer days of television and Memphis wrestling, but getting into the more modern era, it really got kicked off in the late 60s. The conventional wisdom is, and tell me if I'm wrong, that the business in Memphis was starting to be basically bland, that the same talent had been there for a while, and Jackie Fargo had gone and had kind of gone into semi-retirement, and the same matches were being repeated over and over. And Jerry Jarrett was a young man, like 27 years old. He had been riding to Memphis every week with Welch, who was the patriarch of Southern wrestling. And Roy started getting more and more of Jerry's ideas. Well, what do you think? What would you do? And finally, one day, and I believe it was 1969, he announced to the crew that this 27-year-old kid, Jerry Jarrett, the son of Christine Jarrett, who works in my Nashville office and selling tickets for so many years, is your new booker. And a bunch of the guys said, what, this kid? And he said, well, he's actually been booking for the last 3 months or so. So now I'm just making it official. Do you remember at the time when Jerry started getting more control and finally was made the booker, not the fans, they wouldn't know. They didn't know what the booker was, but what the wrestlers thought about it and how the business started changing?
You know, I know how it started changing, or at least I know what my ideas of how it started to change. And you had made you had talked about how when you asked me some time last week, you asked me about how did it change with the different promotions. That is to say, how did they have it set up? How much did they tell us before it all, and so on? Well, the thing that happened that was most notable to me is, and Dave and I talked about this quite a bit, is the fact when Jerry Jarrett came down there, he had everything on the paper down there. It looked like the script for a movie. And when he would get in there with the guys, he would run over all of this stuff. Well, this was much more refined, and so much more finesse that Jerry brought into it that I don't think that any locker room had ever seen quite as much a change in the way the information was disseminated to the wrestlers and how they got their marching orders for that particular program and so on. It just was astounding what a difference there was there, and it started to pick up various aspects of it. When I say it picks up the humor, I'm not saying that they started with that right away, but that's the easiest way to explain it, because in addition to all the drama and the other finesse things that made it interesting for the fans, Jerry was looking more and more and more for things that would make it interesting for the fans, whereas prior to that time, out of the Nick and Roy era, there was nothing except the concentration on the way we think wrestling should be, and we do it, and the fans better like it. And Jerry took it. Yeah, I mean, seriously.
We're kind of going through that these days with Vince McMahon, but go ahead.
Well, You said it, not me.
Yeah.
But Jerry started to bring in things, looking at it from the way that the fans would be affected by something that was said or done or whatever. It's like when they involve the family in it, and they say, "Well, your mother, for crying out loud, don't you be making a word about my mother," and all, and that kind of thing elicited a reaction from the fan, because they didn't want their mother being talked about on the show. They didn't want, and so on. And so I think.
Well, actually, the biggest drawing angle that the early '70s saw in Memphis was Jackie Fargo and Al Green. That came out of Al Green insulting Jackie Fargo's fan, that he was a drunk and an alcoholic and a bum, and Jackie coming out and saying, "Well, my father's dead," and so Al said, "Well, I apologize. My father's dead, but he was still a drunk and a bum," and that was the kind of thing that the fans could identify with. They wouldn't want those things being said about their fan. It got more heat on the heel, and it got more sympathy on the baby face. And Jerry really fleshed out the individual guys' personalities.
That's right. That's a very good way to put it, and that's exactly what it was. And they did have personalities other than, let's stamp this guy good guy and let's stamp this guy a bad guy. I mean, there was more to it. There was a lot more finesse and a lot of depth of how much they went into. It affected the family and this and that. But along the way, ultimately came, in the Memphis area, one of the things that I think made it different than any other territory, based on the guys that I ran into that were in the other territories, had been in the other territory, or the things that they had seen themselves, and that is there was a little humor added to it, and that's because there were humor in the personality that was involved in it. The guys that, like Jimmy Cornette and different guys like that had sense of humor.
Well, and Jimmy Hart later on was just hilarious, because he had watched Memphis wrestling growing up, and he'd learned from some of the and a lot of the managers. The managers got heat, but they would be smart alecks, and they would insult the baby faces, and it would cut to the bone, because half the time we'd be ribbing on the square, but it would get heat because we were I've said this many times today in wrestling, it's all obviously supposed to be funny, but the humor then worked in both directions, because people weren't smart. They didn't know everything was being set up ahead of time, and you like hearing somebody tell a funny fat joke about somebody else's wife, except if it's your wife. That's off limits. Right. So when we would insult the baby faces, for the people who were with it, they would like it, but for the people who weren't necessarily with it, they'd go, "Well, you can't insult him. He's my hero." And it worked.
Yeah. Well, Jimmy, one of the things that astounded me when I went down with Turner Broadcasting and got with WCW on it was the guys that were working down there that had not been particularly strong in Memphis and had not worked in Memphis and all. It made them mad that we were doing business when they weren't doing as much business, and that really irritated them. And they'd say, you guys think it's all so funny down there. Everybody wants to do everything that's funny in there and all. And they were mad because that it was drawing people at the same time that they were laughing a little bit more occasionally, but it did illustrate that would affect the way people would come out to the matches, how they were feeling about it. If they were seriously really hot and mad, they couldn't wait to get there, and that would affect by the sale of the tickets, and that was the premise that I think Memphis wrestling had over the rest of the country that I knew anything about, and listening to the guys talk about it. and you couldn't even say anything that slightly varied from the fact this is not a funny situation. This is a serious. This is guy number one guy in the world. He's a world heavyweight champion. There's nothing funny about that. And
Ole Anderson one time when in WCW at Halloween Havoc, he wanted the Southern boys to hit me over the head with a pumpkin, and the pumpkin would stick on my head, and I'd be running around with a pumpkin on my head, a jack-o'-lantern. And I said, at the time, we were not exactly getting along well, Ole in the office and me in the Midnight Express. And I said, Ole, I'll do all this other stuff, but they ain't going to hit me over the head with a pumpkin. And he said, well, Nick Goulas would have done it. I said, but there's a difference. Nick Goulas drew money. He was always upset about Southern wrestling. But the thing is, what Jerry Jarrett especially was able to master as a booker, and he set the logic and the flavor for Memphis wrestling, was that to humiliate a babyface, it can't be funny. You have to humiliate a babyface in such a way as the fans would be indignant and would know that guy wanted to get even. But the way the babyface would get even was you couldn't hospitalize your heel because you're running every week. So you would set up stipulations that would draw, or instances that would draw, where the babyface finally would give the heel his comeuppance by humiliating him, not putting him in the hospital because he's got to come back and wrestle next week. And it drew that way because the people believed that it wasn't being something that was choreographed and set up. I'm not trying to be on a soapbox here, but it was something that was naturally happening between these wild, unique, colorful personalities. And the promotion facilitated that. And I think that's what set Memphis apart. And once again, with the repetition, 52 Mondays at the Mid-South Coliseum per year, 52 Tuesdays at the Louisville Gardens per year, et cetera, et cetera. But they also had to have good salesmen. And we didn't talk enough last week about your partner. I don't know if there's an announcing team in broadcasting, much less in wrestling, but in broadcasting, that not only had the longevity, but also had the popularity of you and Dave Brown. Ed, talk about how you and Davey got together and how he still remains to this day, 50 years later, one of the most popular television personalities in Memphis.
Absolutely. I'll amen to that one all the way, because Davey just had something about him, has it today. And I know a lot of people don't know this. Some people do know it. But at one point, Dave was considering, had been tapped by the Democratic Party as being a candidate for the House seat, or that's my recollection. And he was considering that, and they recognized this drawing power that he had. And there was, Dave came across as just a good, straight, honest guy and son of a gun. That's what he was.
Yeah.
And I'm glad that he decided to pass that opportunity up, but he did. And that's where the longevity part of that comes in, Jimmy.
Was Dave working at, he was working at WHBQ when he joined you as the co-host of the show, and probably the mid-60s, somewhere around there?
Yeah, Dave was working as an all-night rock and roll disc jockey. That was not his necessary strength, but like everything else, he worked as hard at that as he did anything that he was trying to do, and that was a thing that I recognized in Dave, and it didn't take any great insight to say that it existed in him. It just as the fact that it was oozing out all over. Here's a guy that when he's got a job to do, he'll go work at it. So I was talking to him one time, and we were talking about work, and he was talking about that all-night thing. Sometimes you wonder about whether there's anybody listening out there, blah, 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 blah. I mean, the same thing that everybody else has said. But I said, hey, listen, I'm losing a guy that was working with me on wrestling, and would you have any interest in coming and working? I'd love to have you come join me and work as my assistant. And he said, well, that wasn't exactly what I had in mind, was being a wrestling announcer on it. And And I told him, as Dave has quoted himself, I told him, if you're ever planning on letting television be any part of your life, and that's what you want to do, you better take the opportunity to jump in, because you'll learn more off of wrestling in two months than you will in 2 years anyplace else. And it would be the opportunity. And so Dave said, yeah, okay, fine, we'll do it. And, as they say, the rest is history. And that's the way it went with Dave. And so he came on board, and then I had the opportunity to put in a bingo type game in the middle of a morning movie. And with that, of course, we needed a live figure in there. And so I asked Dave, I said, man, I know you love this. Bing, bing, bing. He jumped in there and just went like he'd been doing it all his life. And following that little episode, Ed Craig, at one time, Ed Craig was a newsman, and he never stopped being a newsman, but he that's what he did. And he also did the weather. And so the station was kind of crimping, getting by on less money by having one guy do the news and the weather. And it became obvious to D.A. Knoll, our general manager, who was just one super great guy and a very smart one too. And he said, we'll never make it unless we get us another news personality, and that is a weatherman doing it. And so we did. And I said, Dave, what do you know about the weather? He said, well, some days it rains and some days the sun shines. I said, wow,
that's good enough, right?
I knew you were brilliant. Yeah, that's real good stuff, man. Anyhow, the answer is Dave took over, and to the best of my knowledge, he is the only guy, certainly in Memphis, and I don't know about in any other place, he is the only guy who became a neophyte amateur weatherman, because he started studying everything there was to study about weather, and he learned as much as anybody in that town knew about weather. And
well, and for the rest of the story, for the folks who are not familiar with Memphis television and maybe our overseas fans, Dave Brown is still doing the weather. He's the most popular weatherman on Channel 5 in Memphis. He recently, this year, after 46 or 7 years of doing that weather, announced that he was going to not retire, but he was going to cut back to 2 or 3 days a week. And the folks were relieved, because in Memphis, if Dave Brown is not doing the weather on television, that means that they just can't have weather. and still to this day, the most popular television personality in Memphis, off of Lance Russell recommending, hey, get on the wrestling program, and what do you know about the weather? But you guys, and I'll tell you that we're jumping ahead, but when the split happened, when Jerry Jarrett split off from Nick Goulas and formed his own company in Memphis, we'll talk about this in a few minutes, but we didn't know anything. I was a 15-year-old kid in Louisville. I just knew that when I turned TV on Saturday morning, I was going to see Lance Russell and Dave Brown bring me my wrestling. And I was not alone. Everybody all over the territory, Memphis and Louisville and Evansville and Lexington and wherever, Nashville, they thought the same thing. And one day, my friend Kenny Bolin and I both at the same time turn on our TVs in our respective houses and see two different guys on wrestling, and we had a heart attack. And the whole show, we were in shock. Where's Lance and Dave? Where's Lance and Dave? You were the program director at WHBQ. Dave was the weatherman at WHBQ at that point. And since Jerry Jarrett had opened up his own promotion, and that was the first week of the new TV that had gone over to Channel 5, WMC, you couldn't follow because you had other jobs there at the station as well. And there was a massive outcry. It made the papers. Fans saying goodbye to Lance Russell and Dave Brown. We were bullshit is what we were. Where is Lance and Dave? And finally, that was the key, that 6 weeks later, you guys moved over to Channel 5, and in one of the biggest broadcasting coups in history, Channel 5 took away from Channel 13 the most popular and highest rated local television program in the market, the program director, and the most popular on-air news personality. Boom. It was a bloodless coup. It just swept the board. And that's how important you guys were to the program, even more so than the wrestlers. There was Jerry Lawler and there was Bob Armstrong and there was whoever. We were wondering where the announcers were. And I got to ask you this. When we talked a lot last week about Roy Welch giving more influence to Jerry Jarrett, whose idea was it to move from the Ellis Auditorium to the Coliseum, or was it necessary because was that when they were tearing the Ellis Auditorium down?
That's exactly what happened. And if you ever saw some guys and they later after that would take you aside and say, let me tell you how smart I am as a wrestling promoter. And it was just the opposite of that. Nick Goulas, this goes back to when we had to change the time, follows in the same spirit. We had to change the time of wrestling from somewhere around 2:33, 3:34, to fit it in around the wide world of sports. I had to keep moving wrestling around, and then ABC took on college football and wide world of sports, and it required different sporting events at different times of the day. And so, man, we got to find some place to do with wrestling or get rid of it. And here we got one of the most popular programs in terms of total audience that we had on the station. And this was one that was where we had all local spots to be sold. That is not the network revenue or something and them paying us a little pittance, whatever it was, to the local station because of the commercial. These were local commercials that they could sell if they had enough audience on them. They could sell for full price, and they could make more money net than a lot of the network stuff ever did for them. So we got the whole search to where to go with it, and that was a long I'll just say that when we moved it up to 11 o'clock on Saturday morning, without going to all the whys or anything else, who hollered the loudest in the world? Nick Goulas. You're putting us out of business. We'll never be able to have any wrestling there. I'm telling you the truth. That's the way it was with Nick.
And that turned out to be probably the best move it was ever made, because that was the spot for the rest of history, pretty much.
It was the best move ever made, and the next best new move that ever made was when they started repairing the downtown auditorium and made them go out to the Coliseum, because that was the only other place that they could hold the people in there that they wanted to try to entice to come out to wrestling. And you talking about fighting that, they absolutely just fought that tooth and toe. You guys are crazy. Let it go out there, man. Who knows how? Well, we don't know. We know what we're doing downtown. Who can tell what's going to happen out there? Will the people come out there? Is there any bus coming out there? Blah, 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 blah. All of the same.
Well, you know, and now in fairness, a lot of times a change in the building back in those days, a change in the particular night that you presented wrestling in a given city, whatever, a lot of that would have a really adverse effect on business. And they were going from the Ellis Auditorium, which I guess probably maxed out at maybe a 7,000, 7,500 seat or something, maybe 8, something like that.
Yeah, I would think that. Yeah.
They were going to the brand new Mid-South Coliseum that seated over 11,000, and obviously I'm sure Nick had his eye on the bottom line, and I'm sure the rent was more. But Jerry Jarrett tackled that, and two guys that he really centered on. It's amazing when you go back and look at when Jerry got the book and he wanted to change talent. He wanted to do these new things. He went back to two guys that were main event stars. Actually, 3 guys, Don and Al Green and Jackie Fargo, were main event stars in the late 50s, early 60s. And the people knew them and they believed in them, but they hadn't been used or they hadn't been there regularly in a long time. And when they moved over to the Coliseum in 1971, he kind of set the thing in motion. And of course, the interns and Dr. Ken Ramey were a big part of the program back then. They had a lot of heat, and Tojo and Jerry himself. But finally, it was Jackie Fargo rather, and Al Green that drew the first wrestling sellout at the Mid-South Coliseum. It took them about a year, and they had nudged up against it, but finally the first legitimate sellout was Fargo and Al Green off of that promo. Hey, my father was not a drunk and he's dead. Well, I'm sorry your father was a drunk and he's dead. And they shaved Fargo's head in the ring, and that's the first time they sold out the Mid-South Coliseum for wrestling. And from there on, pretty much Jackie Fargo was, if he hadn't already been, he was the king of Memphis until Jerry Lawler came along.
Yeah, they've given a great look back over the shoulder exactly what happened to Memphis and what happened to the thing that made them a national figure in wrestling. And I don't care what the guys thought about laughing at it or anything else. The purest thing that nobody could get away from, one, they couldn't get away from the ratings that happened on television. They were the biggest things that anybody had ever seen. And two, of course, going along with the ratings was the money that they were able to bring in with it. They brought in the people, and that brought the money, and so there we were. And it was just an incredible story of almost being forced into success. Of course, that's not the way that a lot of people would want to have it put, but that's what happened.
It was a special deal, and you have, I'm sure, inside knowledge of this, but it was a deal that didn't happen almost anywhere else in the country. That not only was the wrestling program the highest rated show in the market, but also the television, instead of the wrestling promoters like has happened over the last couple of decades, wrestling promoters paying the television station paid the wrestling promoters to allow them to carry the program.
Shucks, I didn't know anybody knew that. Oh,
I know you don't have the Nielsen book sitting in front of you, but moon landing ratings has been a phrase that's been used, but legitimately, the Memphis wrestling program for a long period of time was doing ratings in the 20s and shares of better than 50, was it not?
Yes, it was. As a matter of fact, we had pure ratings, which is a percentage of the total audience that exists in the area of Memphis. Whatever was included in their audience, then that was included in the total audience, and a rating point was 1% of that total audience of people that you had all the way over to Jackson, Tennessee, and all the way anywhere else around it.
About 100 miles in every direction, right? 80 or 100 miles in every direction of Memphis.
And that's one thing that was made Channel 5, WMC, made it a real buddy of wrestling and vice versa, because we were up on Channel 13 at WHBQ, and the signal would not be as close to the earth where you covered as many people going out. It went out, but it would be more straight up in the air, and you'd be up to where there wasn't any people there to take a look at the television. And it went to Channel 5, and that was one of the things that when Lawler and Jarrett came over to my house in the den, and we sat there, and I tried to explain to them when they went to Maury Griner to sell this thing to them, to see if they could get them to take it on, that use this thing about the channel, the low band channel and the high band, what a difference it made, and that not only would he have the advantage of having the audience that was existing for Channel 13, but just right off the bat, it's going to have available more people than anywhere else. This is getting into a lot of stuff.
Well, as a matter of fact, I'm about to say it's so funny because you talk to kids these days and they watch television on their phones and they have no idea what you're talking about when you even say the antenna. But real quickly, folks, a primer in television, UHF channels were channels 14 and up, and the signal was very limited. Maybe it might be 50, 60 miles. VHF was the channels from 2 through 13. And if you break that down even further, and boy, this is fun, I believe it was channels 2 through 7 or so had a stronger signal than 8 to 13. So when you got down into a channel 5, in the days before cable, in the days before satellites, when you literally had to have an antenna on the top of your house or on the top of your television to watch TV, the strength of the station and its signal depended on whether you could get it or not if you didn't live in the metropolitan area. And so for the signal of Channel 5 went pretty much 80 to 100 miles in every direction of Memphis. And do you remember, Lance, what were the best numbers you ever heard, if you even remember, of the wrestling program? Because they used to bandy around 300,000 people every Saturday morning. What were the best numbers you remember at that point?
Well, the biggest number that I remember in terms of a rating was 27. That was 27% of all people who were available in that area to watch television, whether they watched it or not. In terms of numbers of people, that you were dealing at least in the 300,000.
Yeah.
At the very least of it. And I want to tell you, one of the advantages of channel, as long as we're getting off into that stuff that is a little bit maybe too technical for whatever.
Heck with it. It's my show, and I like it.
Okay. Then I'm going to do it. Listen, I lived in Jackson, Tennessee, and didn't have money to buy a great big old antenna to put up on the roof. And so we did it with, and I made reference to it, we did it with 2 coat hangers strung up on a wire and put on our front porch and separated there. And it was aimed right over towards in the direction west of town over to Memphis. And we picked up that channel off of 2 coat hangers. Well, what that verifies and comes right in behind was just what you said, that when you were down on Channel 5, you could do gimmicky stuff like that and get away with it because when you got up above that on Channel 8 and on up there, you could have never gotten that same signal over in Jackson, Tennessee, off of a couple of coat hangers.
And that's where, Channel 5 became so important because everybody could get it, no matter how poor they were down in Mississippi, over in Arkansas, didn't have money for a big antenna. You could get it with coat hangers, folks. And this little local television program hosted by Lance Russell and Dave Brown on Channel 5 every Saturday morning was doing 20-something ratings, which that's the number of people that have television, which would equate to about a 50 or 60 share, that's the percentage of people actually watching television at that time.
Correct.
300,000 folks or so. That is basically the equivalent of doing American Idol live in a local television studio with 20-something rating. That's what they do every Saturday morning. And 300,000 people in one metropolitan area in America, when there's now about 2.5 or 3 million people that are watching Raw in the entire United States. That's the kind of power that Memphis wrestling had. And I got to go back for a second because we've got into the late 70s. But if we want to talk about numbers, probably the most famous matches that you ever called, and we said at the top of the program, you've called more wrestling matches than anybody walking the face of the planet. But the most exciting ones, the greatest ones, the most remembered ones were the ones between Jerry Lawler and Jackie Fargo. And it's so much like Jim Ross's voice is so identified with the Monday Night Raw generation, Austin and Tyson. You couldn't watch Jerry Lawler wrestle Jackie Fargo without hearing Lance Russell's voice. And in the summer of 1974, just in the city of Memphis, I don't have the exact numbers here in front of me. Even Mark James, I'm sure, will update me on those. But basically, for about 12 shows over the summer of 1974, Jerry Lawler and Jackie Fargo did about 100,000 paid admissions in the city of Memphis alone at the Coliseum. And they had some of the greatest brawls, most believable fights that I've ever seen in my life. I used to give them to the guys in OVW and say, this is how you make people believe you're mad at each other. And you were there at ringside. Talk about Lawler wrestling Fargo and Fargo passing the torch to the new king.
Well, that was a boy who who knew how to get with the program. That is not only Jerry, but I'm talking about Jackie Fargo and passing the torch. It always helps when you got somebody like that who is up there on top, and maybe they're not quite so interested in getting rid of it as they should have been, as a matter of fact. Let me do this, Jimmy. One more figure, as long as we're kicking figures around. One of the things that always amazed me about the Memphis wrestling is that there is a figure that was used in the rating books in Nielsen and Arbitron that was a sets and use factor. And that was a factor that showed the percentage of audience that was watching all of that area's television stations. And when at 10:30 you would get a sets and use factor, at 11 o'clock you would get another sets and use factor, because it was a half hour later when the shows changed and all. The difference between Memphis at 10:30 and 11 o'clock consistently was 14% of the sets, of every set that was in the city of Memphis in that area, the metro area, of 14% turned on. Not just necessarily. There
not
was a
just switched
thing.
over, but turned on.
That's right. These
So
were sets that weren't even burning until 11 o'clock came, and here comes Championship Wrestling, and 14% as an average was out of all of the sets in that entire area. Now, I've preached my one figure.
But because that once again, that shows the incredible draw, because not only were more people watching that program than anybody else, but people actually weren't even watching television until that program came on. It was
That's right. That's right.
And that's another incredible statistic, along with, as I just said, Lawler and Fargo. When you think about today, in today's wrestling industry, in one city, and not even one of the top 10 markets, not a New York with 10 million people or Los Angeles with 5 million people, but Memphis, Tennessee, two guys having a fight every Monday night in a 3-month period can sell 100,000 tickets. It's insane. And that's
insane.
Was that your favorite? What was your favorite series? If it wasn't Lawler and Fargo, what was your favorite series of matches to call?
Boy, that I guess probably Lawler and Dundee.
Lawler and Dundee. And that's probably, with the exception of Lawler and Fargo, that's probably the thing that you're second most remembered for, and you were the soundtrack of, and they had a more longevity in their program and drew pretty much almost as well.
Yeah. Listen, let me say, not that anybody cares about Louisville, Kentucky. I'm saying that because I'm saying that because of the current company. There was a time, and I've probably told you this before, Jimmy, because being from Louisville, but there was a time when Jerry wanted me to come up and work with Wayne Ferris on an interview when he had not, he was not the honky tonk man or anything else. He was just Wayne Ferris, and those people in the know knew that he was actually Jerry Lawler's cousin, and that was a secret bit that was privy for a lot of people. Anyhow, he wanted me to come up there and work with Wayne because he was going to be introduced, and he wanted him to get a little sharper on the interviews, and he had to get off to a halfway decent start. So I went up there for that purpose, to work with Wayne, which we did later on. And like in one 30-second interview that he was going to do, ended up taking about 18 times in order to get it where it was acceptable and we could do it. I'm not making fun of Wayne because
he's done well. He's done well.
Yeah, and it's just like Bill Dundee. When Bill Dundee started, he was not the Bill Dundee of today. I mean, Billy improved tremendously too, and he is really a good one and turned out that way, but he didn't start that way. Okay, what I was going to say was the headline in the Louisville show on Tuesday night was Lawler against Dundee. I'd seen him before, called him before, and all that. I was not calling him at the time. I was going as a wrestling fan, watching it, and we were going to do the thing with Wayne. We'd done part of it with Wayne, and then after it was over with, we were going to do the rest of it and practice and do and so on like that. So I watched the match, and what a match they had in Louisville. Big crowd. Everybody was really enjoying it. I went down after it was over with, and I happened to walk down to Lawler's dressing room first, and I looked in there. I said, holy mackerel, he busted you up, man. Look at your face. And Lawler, he got a little hot. He said, well, you ought to see what happened to him. Yeah, he hit me a couple of times, but you ought to see what happened to him. Go over in his dressing room. And I did do exactly that. I went over. Here's Dundee's eye and a puff. He's got his lip was swollen and all. And both of them, they had, pardoning the expression, just beat the hell out of each other. And it was amazing to see the kind of energy that must have gone into that match. And I have never forgotten it. I've told that story 100 times, and I'll probably hopefully tell it another 1,000 before I pass on.
Well, that
was in Louisville.
That was the thing. I'm sure I was there because I think I saw every match they had in Louisville. But anytime you watch Lawler and Dundee wrestle, and it's no secret they weren't the best of friends, but they respected each other, and they respected each other's ability, and they would willingly beat the snot out of each other. Nobody's bones would get broken. Nobody would go to the hospital. There wouldn't need to be any surgery, but there'd be black eyes, and there'd be fat lips, and there'd be a little blood, whether it was one way or the other. They would get a little blood, and that's what caused the people to realize, and that's the thing that Jerry Jarrett always said, if he's going to have an angle and he's going to work somebody, tell the truth as far as you can, so that when you start working them, they say, well, A is true and B is true and C is true, so that means D, E, and F must be true too. And the fans and Lawler and Dundee kept this up even when they were partners. They would meet the fans after the matches at the McDonald's or at the beer stop or the gas station or whatever, and they'd be making snide comments about each other. They didn't ride together, and that's what kept that rivalry going. And you as an announcer sold it so perfectly because you reacted, not only the voice as a soundtrack, but your reactions and the way that you obviously had a fondness for Lawler. The longtime fans knew you brought him on as a teenager, drawing the caricatures. But you would, at the same time, you'd express, when he was a heel, you would express disgust at what he had. Well, there's no cause for that, Jerry. And it was almost sometimes like a stern father or a school teacher admonishing the children that were getting out of hand, but it worked because you weren't just shilling, you were giving an honest reaction to these two guys that hated each other, and you were selling tickets to the fans to see who was going to win and what was going to happen. And I thought, they would not have had the rivalry. Lawler's always called you his Howard Cosell to his Muhammad Ali, and Lawler and Dundee and a lot of those guys wouldn't have had the rivalry that they had and the success they had if it wasn't for having the right salesman. And we can go to Tupelo. The Tupelo concession stand remains my favorite angle in wrestling history. And no other announcer could have sold that thing. And folks, Google it, YouTube it. Everybody's heard about it. It started hardcore wrestling. But Lance, if you hadn't have sold it in the way you did, and just the surprise and the astonishment in your voice at what was going on, and the reality of it, the naturalness of it, I don't think any other wrestling announcer could have done that. They would have gone too far, or it would have become an angle. But with you, it seemed like it was really happening. What did you think when you saw those guys just tear that place apart?
Oh, I couldn't believe it. And the first one was where I cleared the stairs going down, which was up above the concession stand per se. And we grabbed the stuff, and I started down. I hollered at Mike, grab it and help me down here with this microphone. And when I turned around the corner, it wasn't 60 seconds, not even half that long. After I turned around into the concession stand, Lawler threw that gallon jug of mustard right at Wayne Ferris. And I mean to tell you, he couldn't have missed him an inch and a half, and it splattered against a 2x4 in the inside of that concession stand, and glass went everywhere, mustard went everywhere. And you saying, what did I think? I thought, man, I want to get the hell out of here, boy.
No, it actually it looked like attempted murder by mustard. I'm not shitting anybody, because this was not one of these it was a glass jar. And literally, Lance, I don't know if you know this or not, but every teenage boy between the ages of 14 and 18 went to high school all over Kentucky and Tennessee and all over the whole territory that Monday morning. And the only thing that we could say was mustard everywhere. I tell you, though, that kind of that call of the action, where you were obviously nonplussed by what was going on, but still trying to keep your decorum, and the empty Coliseum match with Lawler and Terry Funk, where you made it so natural. You're waiting for this maniac, and then here comes Funk, and he's got and then finally Lawler pokes him in the eye with the wooden stake, and he's bleeding like a stuck hog, and he's screaming, "My eye, Lance, my eye!" That's been the most repeated interview line in wrestling history. And you were the voice of reason in those things. Once again. Well,
bless your heart, Jimmy. I appreciate that so much. I really do. I have I've had a lot of experiences, and a lot of them have to do with those two guys and all. Another one has to be with manager Jimmy Cornette and all of the things that he took place. And I really enjoyed those, and those made me all the more sure that whoever said they were fake. I saw you guys busting each other and using your tennis racket and the whole deal. And
one of my prized possessions is you calling the match where Terry Funk ripped my pants off on live Memphis television without ever asking me ahead of time if I was wearing underwear. And you called that one, and that's a soundtrack that I'll remember all my life. But you've had so many experiences in going on now 60 years, pretty well not even going on past 60 years involvement in wrestling. Memphis, having wrestling as a cultural touchstone, there was a lot of celebrities. You've worked with Joe Louis in the matches on Monday night at the Ellis Auditorium. You've had some of the biggest R&B and soul stars come and be a part of the Memphis wrestling show. They used to sneak Elvis into the back of the Ellis Auditorium. Did they not? Did you ever get a chance to pass any conversation with the original King of Memphis?
No, well, I did not. I did not at the auditorium down there, and I didn't know him. At one time, I did a show with Anita Woods, who worked on Channel 13. She and I worked together and did a show together. She sang. She was a young, very pretty young lady, and she sang and had an outstanding voice. And we did kind of a variety thing featuring her and all of that. And then when she came over to Channel 13 and came down to work on Dance Party at Channel 13. Then Elvis came. I used to come down and pick her up and visit her at the station, and that was a different situation. But it was kind of amazing to have a guy come in and sneak him in up there in that particular section where nobody saw him.
Well, Elvis had a fondness for the girl wrestlers, right? He dated Penny Banner at one time.
Yeah,
I understand he was very enamored of Cora Combs, and he was a big wrestling fan.
Yes, he was. There's no question about that.
You told me a story also when we were talking on the phone last week about it's such a shame all the old tapes are gone, and you admitted you had a hand in that because back in the days of 60s and 70s, videotape was expensive. There was no home video. There weren't reruns really. There of local programming. But you said you wish you could have saved a lot of the shows, but there's one tape you did save. It was that dance party show. Tell the folks about that with who exactly was on it, what happened.
Yeah, well, that was a thing that George Klein was doing, and it was Dance Party, but we had to change the title to Talent Party because we cut out so much of the dancing, and we had the guys coming in there and lip syncing and featuring talent like that on Talent Party. And the talent around America, I mean the biggest talent, you name them, and they were there, would come into Talent Party for George because he could get them into Elvis's. He could get out there and introduce them to Elvis's mother and the whole thing because George was part of the family, you know, and so they would come and react to it, and so that is why at the time two major stars were Sam Cooke from Memphis and Jackie Wilson. And Jackie was riding with Sam and Sam's big plane at the time when they brought him in there, and he had already set it up with George where they would jump off and come down to the station and we would tape a lip sync with them. And so they were coming out there, and Sam came out to lip sync Everybody Likes to Cha 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 or something like that. I forgot exactly what it was. And just they're talking about sense of humor a little while ago. They got caught up with the Memphis sense of humor, and Jackie Wilson, as they come to the second chorus on the thing, and here comes Jackie Wilson boogieing out there, lip syncing Sam Cooke's voice. I mean, it was just exactly like it was Sam Cooke, except it was Jackie Wilson doing Sam Cooke's voice. And then they get out there and kind of do a duet kind of thing on it. And it was just a knockdown, flat, million seller if anybody had it on a disc where they could have gotten this to sell. And we were so stupid that anything like that was still let loose because tape was expensive, man. We can't afford that.
And that's why we're all still trying to scramble and preserve wrestling history. But that was local television in those days, where you could get the biggest stars in entertainment of any kind, and all of a sudden they'd be right there in your living room, as long as you had a couple of coat hangers. Hey, but before we go, because we've kept you long enough, and I appreciate it, but you got to tell one more story because I believe
I'm not coming back next week.
Well, no, hey, you can do that too. We'll just make it Lance and Jim instead of Lance and Dave and do the whole thing. But
oh goodness.
In 1989, I think it was, you came to work with us in WCW, Turner Broadcasting. Hired you away from Memphis. They for a considerable sum, I'm sure. And at the same time, that's when unfortunately the territories were going away, and I'm sure you saw the writing on the wall. With it in terms of the level of business that everybody, even Memphis, was doing in those days. But you came to the NWA. It wasn't a great fit. But one of the things, besides doing some of the syndicated shows and getting a chance to work with you, which I enjoyed, and having the dog do another run-in.
I'm sorry.
That's okay. But one of the things that you did was, back in those days, you did the WCW hotline, which was the 900 number. Back in those pre-internet days, it was like, 1-900, call this. And they had you at ringside in different cities across the country doing the live calls to wrestling matches that they would have. But the problem is they would never change their matches. They had the same card, the same matches every night. And so you literally started having to sit there and call different matches just using the ring sounds as a backdrop. Tell us about that and the response that your audio guy was giving you.
It was one of necessity. The way you described it was perfect, and it was one of necessity. That what are you going to do? We do this. I mean, if you're doing this like trying to cut down the expenses, an airplane ticket, so on, for this trip, and just not have to fly back in to Atlanta and out again and do it again. It would have been that much more on it. So what we tried to do, at least my Scotch mind got working that way, and said, we go to another city the next night. We're doing Tuesday night in Boston, and then the next night we're going to be down in Philadelphia. And so we've got the same guys. We can't do this. We just got through doing that last night. And so what we'll say that it was Lawler and Dundee. It was not, just for the
just
sake of
throw some
about
names
it.
out. Yeah.
Yeah, just throw the names out, and it would be Lawler and Dundee in the Boston matches, and then you would come and the same match would be run the next night in Philadelphia of Lawler and Dundee, but instead it would be Ric Flair and
Jackie
Terry
Fargo.
Funk.
It didn't matter. Terry
or
Funk.
Jackie Fargo, yeah. And so what we did was we would take the same wrestlers and we would change the names and say, we would introduce the just like the referee would introduce them, we'd introduce it on the 900 number and change it over to Ric Flair and Jackie Fargo. And we'd say, and then we'd start doing it, and we would go with the things that they used, and the favorite holes of Ric Flair and the favorite holes of Jackie Fargo, while actually it was Lawler and Dundee that was in the ring doing it down there in Philadelphia.
And the great thing was you were timing it to the bumps and everything, so the ring noise made it sound that you were calling when it was nowhere even close.
Yeah, well, and it was the engineer could not believe what I was doing, and when I started out doing it, because I didn't discuss it with him, because I didn't really know what I was going to do till I think the microphone came on and we got started, and it turned out to be the normal cause of how we got doing those things. So I'd come back off of a trip and have at least 2 different weeks of things with the same virtually the same cost factor to it, and it was one of necessity, Jim. Believe me, it was got a little. It got to be fun at one point, but it was a little nervous at one point too, having that happen. And the guys never did know it until the engineer opened up and told all of them about what was happening.
But yeah, because he's the only one that could hear you at the time, and the people in the arena couldn't hear you, so they didn't know. But then he was so amazed, he started spilling the beans. And we're like, my God, Lance is so good. He can call fictitious matches. All he needs is ring noise. And that's when you left WCW. You've been back and forth. You went back and forth to Memphis for a while and did guest spots on the shows. And of course, and I'll never be able to repay you, and I'll always treasure the night you came and you called the first bluegrass brawl for me in Smoky Mountain Wrestling in Pikeville, Kentucky. And it was so hot in that building. It was jammed, and the wrestlers went crazy, and they were fighting all over the building, and you brought it all together. And I've crossed something off my bucket list just in the fact that Lance Russell called a match that I promoted, and I'll never be able to repay you for that. But have you called you've been back to Memphis in the last several years a number of times for the Memphis Heat premiere, and I believe for the latest casino show here just a few months ago where they were paying tribute to Lawler. But I'm just wondering, have you called any matches in the last 4 years? Because if you had, that would be 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s, 2000. That would be 7 decades. You got 6 decades, but did you make 7?
Ooh, boy, that's a long time.
And amazingly enough,
now,
you're only
Jimmy,
57 years old.
I did call one because I came set to do the whole thing. That was the night that we were supposed to be in Memphis at the same big auditorium that the Monday night that they had Raw on there, and from that same thing, we were down there to do Hulk Hogan and Jerry Jarrett.
That's right. The
Jerry
FedEx
Lawler.
Forum, the FedEx Forum down
FedEx
there.
Forum,
They were going to have Lawler and Hogan have that match, and Jerry had to pull out. That's right.
Yeah, Jerry had to pull out of it, and so Big Show came in, and we did the match. I did that match, and that is actually the only match I did. I've done some of the Legends thing, but it was more of like, I'm not doing it like I was doing the commentary. I was just kind of telling them, and I was talking to Jimmy Cornette at ringside as things were going down, and it wasn't like I was really doing it. Now, the Hogan show thing I did as a regular one, but that's
so
the
hey,
one that
6 decades or 7 decades? What's a decade at this point?
Who's arguing?
Lance, thank you so much. I said it at the top of the program. I say it to everybody. You're a broadcasting legend. You are one of pro wrestling's treasures. You're the voice of my childhood. And I hope you realize not only the people in Tennessee, the people in Kentucky, Arkansas, Mississippi, all over the area, I hope you realize how much you mean to every wrestling fan of the last 60 years. Our childhoods, our memories wouldn't be the same without you, and we appreciate everything that you've done for the wrestling business and for television in general in some very trying circumstances. Thank you so much.
Jimmy, thank you so much, and I mean this so sincerely. If I could take another 15 minutes, I could do it easily with the great things that you've said about me, and if even a third of them were true, it is something that I will never forget, and it is on my bucket list to have somebody who really understands the business like you do, and you're few and far between to have you say things as you've said about me, and I thank you, sir. I hope we can maybe do something like this at least one more time. It's too much fun to pass, so if you ever need a standby fill-in, holler. We'll think of something to say one way or the other.
I tell you what, to end this episode of the Jim Cornette Experience and sign off until next week, Lance Russell, you do the close. Instead of Dave Brown, you're with Jim Cornette. Give me a bye-bye, everybody, just so I can hear it.
Okay, we've had it tonight. I mean, you've seen the best of the best. We're tickled to death to be here, and until next week, we'll be looking forward to you with Jim Cornette and Lance Russell. Until then, bye-bye, everybody.